Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Debatable with your hosts, Nina and Kyle. I'm Kyle.
I'm Nina, and this episode is part of our debate analysis series, a series of episodes dedicated to explaining the motions of Debatable Open 2022. The goal of this series is to give debaters a better understanding of the different topics they've encountered as they competed in the tournament and give those who weren't able to join us a chance to learn from the motions as well. Today, we are joined by Miggy Sulit, who gave us our topics for the international relations theme of the motions. Of the tournament rather.
Yeah.
So hi Miggy, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Hi Nina, hi Kyle, hi everyone. Thanks for having me.
So, first things first, tell us about yourself and what you enjoy about IR as a topic.
Oh man, I don't want to scare the viewers, but when I first got messaged about IR, I was like, I'm an accounting major. Why on earth am I being messaged for this? But I guess just to share a bit, I really got into IR not because it's related to my course or related to anything I plan on doing in the future, but just because, one, I was in that niche of people who read a lot and are very nerdy, and that kind of became my personality for a while in debate. So it just got forced onto me. And two, I don't know, I just ended up having a lot of false friends who rant about the class, and that's how I got into IR.
Yeah. Oh shit. Yeah, I feel like a great way to be able to be good at matter loading and IR in general is to have friends to talk to about it. Because otherwise people just go like, nerd.
That is true. That is very true. Obviously there's a bit of vanity involved at first. Like if it's something that everyone's scared of and you're reading it, there's a bit of self-esteem boost that comes when the motion finally comes out. So I won't lie, that is something that motivated me. But I think the part of me that kind of kept me interested in it is it's such a grand scale topic, but it still interacts with you in your real life. Like I remember one thing that really amused me was a bridge that we used to go to Rockwell. It connects Mandaluyong and Makati. Apparently, that's been funded by like Chinese One Belt, One Road loans. And that's crazy, right? This is such a big theoretical topic, and yet it affects my commute to a shopping mall. So, shallow amusements of life, I guess.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting segue to my next question, because it seems that IR is all around us, but there's a lot of misconception about it. So I kind of want to ask, based on your experience as a judge, a debater, as someone who's also part of different ADJ corps, what do people usually get wrong about international relations? And what advice would you give them in addressing this theme and the motions that come with it?
Oh man, I think it's a question that already prompts an answer. Like whenever people see the IR set, it's always, oh no, I haven't read. And the not helpful advice I've heard given too often to this is, well, just read more. And I don't find it particularly helpful because, one, I think a lot of people read a lot, they're just not reading the right things. But two, it's kind of an impossible piece of advice to follow, right? Like the reason people don't spend their entire day reading about IR is because people have their lives outside debating, and that's perfectly normal, and there's nothing wrong with that. And asking another 3 hours or 2 hours a day for IR is a bit of a difficult ask. So I think getting used to IR is more about efficiency than just sheer volume of being exposed to things. So the first good tip I got, shout out to my policy friends, is early on in debate, I was really reading like sheer volume to just cover everything in IR. Like I would listen to Economist's daily IR updates, then Vox, and then New York Times, and it would take 3 hours a day in total. And like I could do that for 1 year, but afterwards, like no, that's incredibly tiring. So the advice I got, or that I realized was useful, is read a bit of like theory. I remember there was a very early debatable episode about all the IR theories, mga realism, liberalism, Marxism, etc. And honestly, that's going to do so much work compared to just knowing everything that's happening everywhere in the world. Having an analytical tool, even if you're not familiar with a specific matter, is so useful. My other advice is just use newsletters. Like again, like 3 hours a day is not a sustainable matter loading lifestyle for a lot of people. So what I do nowadays, I have a newsletter that releases every 2 weeks, and then another one that releases every month. And I just read them when they email to me, and that's how I get my IR updates. If anyone's curious, so once every 2 weeks is called AKE Intelligence. It's just political crises per region, and they give you a brief summary. Then there's a link if you want to read more. The monthly one is called Crisis Watch. And it's just all the conflicts in the world, what are the updates, which ones have substantially improved or deteriorated. And you only have to read it once a month, and you're pretty much set. So that's my math loading advice. My last piece of advice is like, oh, sorry, you're gonna say something?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
There was a saying in my old institution, ASHS, and I'm very cautious to give it as an advice because people use it as a crutch and they shouldn't. But the joke before, half joking, was to say that IR isn't about matter, IR is about framing. And the reason I don't like this phrase is because people use it as an excuse not to matter load. But for some reason, people seem to think that the rules of debating have been suspended temporarily in an IR set. It's always about example vomiting. It's always about giving the most like specific statistics because you're showing off that you've read. But no, right? Like your examples are only as good as your ability to logically prove them. And I think, not as a crutch, but as a reminder to people who do read or don't read that, debate rules still apply, right? If you say, aha, go to this country and you will know that this is really what's happening. If you don't structurally prove how that happens, and GG pa rin. It's my slightly long-winded hot takes on IR.
Yeah, so with that being said, I think we can move on to the motions themselves. The first one being, this House believes that NATO should not make democratization a prerequisite for membership. The first question actually stands out to me, and I'm sure it stands out to many novice debaters, is what exactly is NATO? We've seen NATO a lot in the news lately, and it just seems to be some weird, ambiguous collection of states, probably the United States first and foremost. If you don't actually know what it do, how does it work?
Okay, I'm gonna give you a textbook answer, and I'm gonna give you a life is complicated answer. So the textbook answer is, it's a defensive military alliance that was started after World War II in order to contain communism, spread American power projection, and prevent other states like, let's say, for example, Germany becoming the dominant military power. And pretty much, it started out as just a few Western European countries. Eventually, the US realized, we need this bloc to project our goals. So the US joined, and there were several waves of expansion. So at first, it was countries that were potentially going to slide towards the USSR. So Greece, Turkey, West Germany was the first wave of expansion after the initial Western European members joined. Later on, Spain, when they embraced democracy, so this one's a bit more related to the motion, was also able to join. And later on, more countries, notably in the somewhat close to the former Soviet Union, countries joined. So the Czech Republic joined, Hungary joined, Poland joined. And more recently, it's been creeping closer and closer to Russia. But ostensibly, it's still a defensive military alliance that is centered on Europe and the US with the goal of protecting and spreading democratic values and protecting their collective self-defense. So that's what the US would tell you. But the fun thing about IR is, it's not always true, right? Like there's so many things that happen. Is it always a defensive military alliance? Is it always only military in nature? Is its goal really just to be a peacekeeping force, or are there more subtle goals such as like containing Russia that are involved as well? Because NATO's like stated goals and the ways it actually conducts itself are not necessarily always going to be the same, right? So while on paper it's a defensive alliance, there were instances when they got involved in the affairs of non-member states. For example, in Libya, when Gaddafi was in a civil war, it was NATO that enforced no-fly zone over the country. That wasn't a member state. That wasn't defensive, and the Russians were all over them about it. I think in Kosovo, they engaged in a bombing campaign at one point. That wasn't a defensive military alliance. So there's also, and I'm kind of hinting at the arguments now, some reason that Russia doesn't like it, doesn't see it the same way as it self-identifies. But that's the fun and complexity of doing IR motions that are complicated. You can't even agree on the definition.
Yeah, so what's interesting about NATO is that it's different in practice than it is on paper. But the complexities in it come really in its membership. So I kind of want to ask, based on your understanding of NATO, or I guess like based on what you want to share, how does one really become a member? Like besides democratization, like you've already mentioned, what does it mean to become a member? What obligations exist? What do they owe each other? Is it something that people can just willingly join? How does this play out?
So membership is based on a few principles, right? So this one is functioning democracy. That's a democratization standard. There's also expectations that they will implement a market economy. There's also a preference for resolving issues peacefully and respecting the sovereignty of other NATO countries. And this was Trump's favorite before, although it's not necessarily as strictly enforced. There is a expectation that you'll be willing to militarily contribute to NATO operations. So it's generally a pro-democracy, pro-free market, military alliance. And so long as you're able to continue to adhere to the standards, you're able to still partake in NATO. Or that's how you are able to join NATO and keep your membership. It's interesting that there is no explicit expulsion clause in NATO. But there is, some scholars have argued, a way to argue that if you violate those kinds of principles, a case can be made for you to be expelled. Some arguments have been made about Turkey. Other arguments have been made about some Eastern European countries that are sliding back democratically, and that'll factor in a bit later in the arguments. But generally speaking, I think no one has been kicked out yet, although that is something that could happen in the future.
So,
in terms of how, sorry.
So,
in terms of how the okay, go Kyle.
oh, sorry. I was going to ask, since it seems like democratization has always been a standard or a prerequisite. I guess my question is, why did it really have to be that way? Like when NATO was created, was it always intended to be just a bunch of democracies? Especially considering that like its purpose is to be a defensive organization. So why do you need to be a democracy in order to do that goal of creating to create a defensive bloc or whatever NATO is supposed to be?
Definitely. So I think we have to remember the historical context. It was originally founded in post World War II, when you were shifting from defeating the Axis to the Cold War between the US and the USSR. So democracy was part of the way that the US also wanted to keep the USSR in check, right? And that was its purpose for the most of the Cold War. But as we know now, without the USSR, it's kind of devolved into not necessarily a purposeless entity, but the impetus to contain communism, spread democracy doesn't seem as strong in present day compared to back during the Cold War. So a lot of people even question, is NATO still something that should exist? Does it have relevance given that all its original objectives have been achieved? Sorry, wait, was there another part to your question?
No, I was just asking, why was it a prerequisite considering that it's just supposed to be a defensive bloc? Like, does NATO assume that in order for it to be an effective defensive bloc, you first need to be a democracy?
Yeah, that definitely was assumption in counteracting the spread of the Soviet Union and authoritarian communist states. But again, like without that, that's what's being called into question, which is motion.
So I guess my next question is, how do you check for this prerequisite? Like, what are the standards for you to be considered a democratized country? Is there like a yearly check-in? Do they just check you once and then they don't care what happens to you afterwards? What's the system like for this?
So from my understanding, the most important check-in is at the point where you are let into NATO. And I think the clearest example of this is what happened to Spain, right? So for the longest time after World War II, they were a Francoist dictatorship. They had a transition period with the monarchy, and they eventually had a peaceful transition of power in 1982. And 1982 was also the year that they were accepted into NATO. So that's the clearest example of democracy being the roadblock that's preventing a country from getting membership. It is, when you are able to show you can have free and fair elections peacefully, that you get in. So that's one standard. But I don't think it's super hard defined. It's more of a statement of principles that members are expected to abide by. So the actual process, of getting in. Eventually, the final step is going to be, do all the current members unanimously think you should be in based on the guiding principles mentioned earlier? So it is a bit ambiguous, although I do think that might have been done on purpose.
So on government, you're supposed to defend that we shouldn't make it a prerequisite. But in that case, what would be the prerequisite then? What would the alternative be? Like, if it's not a standard, what would membership now be based on?
So I think on government, just for the sake of not changing too many things and having too many things to defend, I would keep the other standards. So market economy, you can keep that. Treating your minority populations fairly, you could keep that. Committing to resolve conflicts peacefully before escalating militarily, you can also keep that, etc. So you can keep all the other standards that exist now, but probably you would need like some phraseology about what constitutes a legitimate government if it's not democracy. Perhaps depending on how the case you'd want to run would go, yes, it could be a commitment to respecting sovereignty, or it could be about service delivery, right? So are you able to provide for the needs of your citizens, regardless of whether or not you're a democratic state? Because so long as people's lives are getting better, that's something that NATO can still support you in, so long as you are not breaking those like minimum thresholds of not abusing your population.
So we can jump now to the arguments, I guess. And I guess for this motion, it's usually divided into two parts, right? Like proving the harms of the current thing and improving the counterfactual to be beneficial. So let's start with that first one. What are the harms of this current standard for membership? And why do you think, if you were in government, democratization is not the way to go?
So I think there are three areas that could be affected by this. So one is aspiring members. Two is, it's a bit further out since no one's been kicked out yet, but it has been raised in the past. Members of the prob that are arguably backsliding from democracy and may no longer meet these standards on a technical level. And I think the third one is just like dealing with Russia. Like that is the elephant in the room in terms of a lot of NATO's policy. So right now there are three aspiring members, right? Ukraine, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia. These are all democratic countries, but I think there are times in Ukraine in particular's past when you could say that because of all of these requirements in joining NATO, that led them to choose an independent foreign policy rather than strictly aligning with the East or the West. And there is a strong argument to be made that all these requirements are pushing countries towards trying to strike a balance with neutrality rather than fully being willing to commit to NATO. And as like right now, the current matter seems to prove that doesn't seem to be a tenable strategy for a lot of countries. Now, does that require you to defend some level of authoritarianism? Perhaps, but precisely because these are just statements of principles and ultimately it's the member states that decide if they're abiding by it, there can be some allowance in terms of like, okay, how authoritarian is too authoritarian? What level of like Russian cooperation is acceptable? Even if it distorts democratic mechanisms, etc. The second group of countries I think it affects is countries that are potentially on their way out. So I think Turkey's use of force and general authoritarianism has called in some questions about the suitability to be in NATO. So there's no like standing motion to expel them, but if trends continue, there is a real chance that they could like go below that minimum threshold. But again, like go back to the idea of what NATO's goal is right now. If it's Russian containment, then countries ejecting themselves or being ejected out is exactly what Russia wants. So this could also be a bit of a prophylactic move just to prevent countries from leaving the West's sphere of influence. So long as even if they're not fully democratic, they still have some commitment to human rights, to not actively hurting their populations, even if their elections are not perfect. The last area in terms of government is there is a fairly popular, not super popular take that a lot of Russian aggression is explainable by the encroachment of Western liberal democracy closer and closer to its borders, right? So the fact that more countries are politically aligning with the West, aside from being a military threat, and I think like the military risk is going to be the same on either side, but the fact that they are looking more and more like Western liberal democracies, there's a strong argument to be made that perhaps this scares Russia into thinking there will be domestic threats in its own country, especially if they're right across the border, that they're running out of allies. And saying that that is no longer a hard ideological goal of NATO's, converting all these countries to democracies, could be a way that not necessarily gets Russia on your side, but prevents them from thinking that the West is actively out to get them. And the argument goes that if the enlargement of NATO were not this ideological battle against Russia, it could have ended a bit more peacefully.
So I guess for Gov, the next part is what would be the benefits of removing the standard? Like we already talked about why it's harmful, but the converse would be why would removing it be actually a good thing? Like how could it achieve the goals of NATO better if ever that is an issue in the debate? So yeah, like if we're going to talk about what NATO is for, I think gov teams have to argue that removing this standard actually brings us closer to that goal. So how would you recommend gov teams to do this?
So definitely, I think I would just go to the same policy areas that came up in the problematizing. So for aspiring countries, they will no longer feel that the West or the US is imposing its own government structure on them, that they will be able to at least maintain a hybrid enough regime not to actively antagonize Russia. For countries that are backsliding, it's a bit difficult to defend authoritarianism, granted, but keeping them in the alliance and preventing them from being invaded or taken into Russia's sphere is arguably like a better thing for the citizens. And then thirdly, I guess it's like some kind of permanent settlement with Russia. It's very hard to argue that they will completely demilitarize if democracy is no longer standard. But I definitely think in terms of it is one of the multiple drivers of Russian aggression, it might be also easier to reach some kind of agreement with them.
I guess we can now go to opposition and sort of analyze it from the flip side. Or I guess in this case, it would be status quo, right? So how would you argue for the necessity of this standard?
So I think the not just argument, but also the tone I would strike at opposition is, you're playing this 5D geopolitical chess game with Russia, but hello, propping up authoritarian dictatorships is bad. Hot take. I hope that's not controversial. I think so after you get past that principle, I do think that the other argument I would take is, in many ways, like, this commitment to democracy is one of the only things really holding NATO together. That a lot of, for example, Western European countries are also a lot more economically interlinked with Russia. And one of these things that they have in common with the US, and they have in common as, like, quote unquote, the West in general, is that shared commitment to democracy. So you could also question, is this the last thing holding NATO together? Possibly. But also, it's not as if all the things that, like, Gov is going to say are going to come true, right? Does the current framework allow for countries to have some lapse into authoritarianism? Because that's the nature of elections. Sometimes you elect a government that doesn't fit into your liberal democratic mode. I don't necessarily think that the remedy always has to be expel them the moment they get a bit authoritarian. There might be some room, maybe with closer military cooperation, maybe with economic incentives, to work within the existing framework and also guide these countries a bit closer back to democracy. In terms of Russia, then, I think the current matter supports giving Russia concessions is not going to appease them. They will just ask for more, a bit more than the Gov framing. Like, the way that Gov frames it is that this is one of the things that Russia is motivated by, this fear of liberal democracy at its doorstep. But it's clearly not the only things they're motivated by, right? Like, it's also a lot of expansionism. There's also a lot of, maybe spoilers for the second motion, nationalism involved. So arguably, like, you're granting some concessions, but you're getting nothing in return. So might as well stick to your guns.
So I guess now, like, since we're now talking about opposition, what are the harms of the alternative standards that would be given by government? So government here would be saying that it's not about being a democracy, it's about all these other standards. But the question now is, why would just using those standards be harmful, especially the ones that you talked about earlier?
Definitely. So far, we've been discussing these standards as if they're all separate things, right? But I think there's a strong case to be made that the ability to have a market economy, or the ability to respect things like property rights, or a willingness to resolve conflict peacefully, or be willing to respect other NATO member states. You could argue that a lot of that comes from being politically aligned with all these other countries, making it much more difficult to be aggressive towards them, right? And a lot of that also stems from democracy. So you could say that, if there's no political alignment in terms of like government form, in terms of a commitment to democracy, how likely are all these members going to follow their promises on these other things, if those are also things that democracies tend to pursue and authoritarian governments tend to not pursue? So at a certain point, like if you don't think they're going to follow it, then you might as well not have that standard.
So the last thing I want to ask for this motion, and to wrap things up before we move on to the next topic, is what else would be affected by this motion? So I based on our conversation, it seems that a lot of it is very geopolitical, very related to international relations, and admittedly, these are not very accessible topics or accessible arguments, especially for those who might not know a lot about NATO or even the prerequisites of membership, or even what's going on with the world right now. So if you were in a position of a debater who's completely new to this, how would you approach a motion like this? What other angles would you look into? What extensions can you possibly think of outside of what was already discussed?
I think I think without going into the intricacies and specifics of how NATO works, what the other angle you could argue is, how does NATO get involved militarily, and what does that look like if it is a democracies only club, right? So thinking that democratization is really, really important to this entity might bias or prejudice the kinds of interventions it's supposed to make, right? So by seeing itself as a enforcer of democracy, arguably that might make it a bit trigger happy in terms of intervening in other countries and supposedly humanitarian pretexts it invades, for example. That might be something that also worsens or also hurts its credibility as an organization, and perhaps having a few more hybrid governments or flawed democratic governments within the consensus building process, or the process of like deciding when you intervene, would also maybe one, like help it choose better when it needs to intervene, or two, if it does intervene, grant a bit of credibility that this is not a democratic imposition of our government form on other countries. Here are a diverse group of people that all agree that this is a necessary step to take. So I think that's a nice angle for extension.
Okay, so we can move on to the next motion, which is about myth making. So it's about opposing the use of nationalist myth making in constructing and justifying foreign policy decisions. The first question here would be, what even is nationalist myth making in this context? How would you characterize it? What does it even look like?
So just go on a slight tangent. The inspiration for this motion was the U.S. Embassy in Kiev released a meme. It showed Moscow and it showed Kiev on different dates in the Middle Ages, and Kiev had all these cathedrals, architecture, buildings, whatever, and Moscow was just like roads and like forests. And I'm like, this is a meme, but what's the point of this? Like, what are all these countries trying to do when they try to make these conflicts not just about the pragmatics of what's happening, but they also try to tie it into some sense of national identity? So I think that's a distinction I would make when talking about nationalist myth-making. It's not just the pragmatic considerations of, do we enter this country, do we declare war, do we engage in sanctions, do we join in this agreement? It's also making it, how do you say this, a bit more personal, right? It's also about the identity and the grand historical narrative that your country bases its decisions on, rather than just pure pragmatics. So it's not just like, this isn't about like historical fabrication, right? This is about simplifying the complexities of history into making this internally coherent narrative that you also use as the basis of your foreign policy.
So I guess the next part of this motion, I mean, if we're defining terms here, would be the foreign policy decisions. And I kind of want to see what you were imagining this debate to be about. Like, what foreign policy decisions do you expect both teams to be talking about primarily?
So I definitely think, again, like recency bias, like war and invasions are definitely going to be a big talking point in this round, right? So if one of the things you're watching, if you're following the news in Ukraine and Russia, is how Russian media is sort of priming the public for an invasion. So talking about the cultural differences between Ukrainians and Russians or other Russian propaganda like that is also an important part of their way of justifying and selling to the public these decisions. So even conversely, on the Ukrainian side, you also have this nationalist narrative of anti-Russian resistance that has been arguably quite effective in really selling the resistance to occupation to the citizens, getting them willing to contribute to the fight rather than give up even against a technologically superior and militarily superior opponent. But I also think like a bit less intuitive is also friendly action. So joining regional unions, maybe even negotiating treaties with different countries. The idea of you not doing it just out of pragmatism, but because you have a certain role to play on the international stage. Let's say the US likes to think of itself as this world police that must enforce order on the rest of the world. Maybe Japan's national myth could also be about pacifism and non-interventionism. It really depends per country. Russia sees itself as in some kind of civilizational war against, quote unquote, the West. And that affects all sorts of decisions, not just wars, but also when you sign an agreement with another country. Do you see them as an ally? What kinds of interventions do you engage in? Are they mostly just sending aid? Are you willing to engage in war as a part of your foreign policy? Those are also motivated by how you see yourself as a country.
So on Gov, what would it mean to oppose the use of this myth making? Particularly, what I want to ask is, what would the alternative be? Like right now, these governments are doing this nationalist myth making in order to justify foreign policy decisions. But on Gov, what other kinds of narratives could they use in order to justify these decisions? Or like, is it just gonna be like cold, robotic facts? Is that what's expected for Gov to argue in this debate?
I definitely think like like it may boil down to cool robotic facts, but obviously if you're a Gov team, um, you want to try and pitch it a bit. How would I phrase it? So maybe it's not a matter of pitching the hard facts as a principle, but the way I would phrase the principle is you want to be honest with your constituents, right? Like this is what we are going into. These are the costs we might incur. This is why we are still doing it. Do we have the public support rather than playing into their like emotional attachments to the country, or in many ways using this mismaking as a kind of cattle prod to corral citizens into supporting what the government wants rather than the other way around, which is how like democracy should work. Maybe like this, the less emotion ladenness is not about raw objectivity, but just a matter of allowing citizens headspace to think for themselves without being kind of like pitched based on these very emotive nationalist feelings.
So if that's the pitch, you want it to be much more straightforward, much more matter of factly. It doesn't have to be robotic. Like, I don't agree with how Kyle phrased it earlier, but I mean, it makes sense. If you were in opposition, you'd phrase it to be that way, right? But
Exactly.
yeah, so the next question I have is, what would you argue in government? What's the necessity and what are the benefits of being very straightforward, especially to constituent that might not understand facts and might be like more into the memes that Ukraine is posting right now?
Definitely. So I think that does make it harder to justify a lot of interventions. But on government, I would argue like those are important constraints to have, right? Look at how easily you can whip up the public into from not supporting a war to play the propaganda machine a bit, and suddenly a lot of them are in favor. Like that is a crazy amount of power for a government to have. And if the Republic just gets bored, like that might just be a better alternative rather than going into a very costly and probably very violent war that might drag on for God knows how long. But also the matter of factness might also make the like in the event that the intervention is justified. The matter of factness, the fact that people are upfront and knowing that this is what is going to cost us, and knowing that we're doing it anyway because of these reasons. That might make people a bit less enthusiastic in the short term, but in terms of managing expectations, in terms of not allowing the overselling of how well it's going to go motivate the public, that might also make for a more sustainable policy moving forward. Because if you hype it up and the memes don't come true, then that's also going to be a problem. for the country in the future.
So we can move on now to opposition. We already talked about what the counter policy or what the stance of opposition might be, especially like even in terms of clash, like we already talked about how opposition has an interest in portraying Gov's alternative to be like cold and calculating as opposed to like actually emotionally resonant. But what could opposition argue building off of that? Like, how would you justify this nationalist myth making? Because I feel like in the debate sphere, there is sort of a bias or at least like an inclination towards truth. And the way that this motion is worded, like the term used is myth making, it already seems like they're just making stuff up. So how would you justify that on opposition?
Okay. So I think on opposition, I definitely would first try to make a distinction between like actively fabricating information and just creating parang a nationwide nationalist way of why we do things and what our identity is and tying that identity to your foreign policy. But I guess it can also be quite useful at times. So we've been assuming that the country engaging in myth-making is quite aggressive, arguably quite evil. And we've been using Russia as an example, but that can also be an advantage that militarily inferior states have. For example, the reason there's so much public opposition to Russia that can also, in Ukraine, for example, be used to at least make it very difficult for the country to get invaded if it's not an actual deterrent, make it more unfeasible. The fact that you have won over the public in terms of motivating them to not to continue to resist these kinds of things can also be quite important, especially if you're a militarily inferior country. And arguably, like that is probably close to one of the only resources these sorts of countries can have: the willingness to fight and die for your homeland. Especially if you don't have like big allies, can be like the last deterrent you can have to actually getting invaded. That this is something you will fight tooth and nail for. I also think that it's important to have these kinds of like emotionally resonant narratives because like if you're in the face of like occupation, the most natural thing to do would be maybe keep your head down, avoid resisting opposition. And while that may make sense on an individual level, on a collective level, there's a very strong argument to be made that weaken the country.
So thank you so much for those arguments. I guess the last thing I want to ask before we wrap this one is, besides, the very timely issue of Russia and Ukraine, what other situations or bits of matter would you recommend people look into if they want to know more examples and situations where this motion might apply?
So yes, I think we've been talking about war for most of this, right? But war is not the only foreign policy decision that countries make. I think one nice example could be regional union. So when countries deal together, whether it's the EU or ASEAN, there is also this level of we have a shared identity, we have a shared history, and that is why we're uniting. And that might be a better sell to the public than just like raw economics and the geopolitical facts and the need for balancing different powers. That might be a better way to sell a lot of regional cooperation as well. On the other hand, so I think that's how I would defend nationalist myth making. Other examples for opposing it might also be just like not just authoritarian invasions, but also like even democratic countries can be prone to this. For example, the list of countries the US has invaded on Wikipedia is notoriously long. And you could argue, maybe that's also because they have the sense of them protecting the rest of the world. It's a manifest destiny to decide how other countries are run. And perhaps if they tone that down a bit, they wouldn't be this aggressive in terms of intervening in other countries' affairs. So it's not necessarily just on authoritarianism thing. Democratic countries can also be prone to this, hype train.
So moving on to the last motion for this set, the motion reads, as occupying countries rebuilding post-intervention states, this House would grant preferential legal privileges to citizens that were not complicit in wrongdoing. I feel like this is a very complicated motion because there's so many moving parts. So I guess the simplest thing that we can talk about first, like to break it down, what does it mean to be a post-intervention state? Is it different from like a post-conflict state or like a young state or a new democracy, whatever? How would you characterize their situation in the country, especially in relation to this motion?
So I think the easiest way to answer that is like, when do interventions happen? Usually, there's been some horrible incident in the country, and the international community says, okay, enough is enough. We need to prevent this from happening. So this might be a situation where like the government has committed atrocities, shot protesters, suppressed minorities, and it's gotten to a point where maybe NATO, maybe the UN says, okay, we need to stop this from happening again. So there is like some level of injustice, which is why the motion's phrased in terms of wrongdoings and responsibility for those wrongdoings. So obviously, because you've just been invaded, you're probably in the hands of some form of caretaker government. So that's where the legal privileges come in. You need to reconstruct the new legal system that this country will live on. You need to hold elections. I need to figure out who's going to be having political power in these scenarios, because you can't. Well, hopefully you don't, as an occupying power, stay there forever. I don't think that there are. I'm not sure how much of the debate can happen in immoral interventions, but I do think there are nuances to be had in interventions with a bit of gray area, that the occupying country might not necessarily fully understand the ethnic divisions in the country. It's going to be a bit more opposite, but I think Gov can do some stuff here too, where the occupying country doesn't necessarily understand every nuance in the country that it's occupying. You probably want to set up some kind of system for them to autonomously govern themselves sooner rather than later.
So the next part of this motion is about the preferential legal privileges. So how would you describe them? Like, what makes them privileges per se? How do people access them? What does it mean to be preferred? Basically, what do you imagine these members of a society having that others don't?
Will it be like a social credit system? Like, oh, you didn't participate in wrongdoing before, I will give you a job.
Yeah.
That's maybe not a job, but that's honestly not so far from what I thought. Because so there are two areas I think that this debate happens in. Maybe there are more that teams mentioned. One is in terms of political representation, right? So who will end up being in the UN-backed government? Like, who's going to be calling the shots? Is it going to be the same people as before? If so, how do you prevent problems? The same problems from arising. Is it going to be the ones who weren't in power and didn't commit these atrocities? Is that government going to be any better? Will it be more stable? Will it be able to even hold the country together if it doesn't have that experience of being in power? Those are all questions up for debate. The other area I think this applies in is the reparation scheme. So earlier we mentioned that some horrible injustice had happened in the country, and you are probably going to be wanting to compensate the victims for that. And usually the way that it happens is like, you make the country responsible, right? So you as a state figure out your taxation policy, pay these indemnities to the people that you wronged. But within the members of that state, people can be more or less innocent, right? You maybe on an extreme end, there were people who were not born yet when those atrocities happened, but you must still pay the costs of reparations through things like taxes. Maybe there are people who were imprisoned. On a more moderate angle, maybe there are people who were instrumental in the government's policy because they supported the government, like, economically, they paid their taxes, but could have voted against these governments. They could have protested these governments anyway. Are those people innocent? So like, it's also about the sheer nuance of all these kinds of actors that exist in these countries, and how you're going to allocate responsibility for those wrongdoings as represented by your legal system, let's say your tax code, the burden of reparations to these different actors.
So in this motion, it is basically making a distinction, right? We are treating one group of people differently from another group. So the question now is, are these real and substantial differences? Like, who are these actors anyway? And what kind of wrongdoings have they committed that on government would warrant this differential treatment? And how would you, on government or opposition, characterize who these actors are and what the extent of their wrongdoing was?
This is a fun question, the motion, because complicity is such a subjective thing. So it's very up for debate. So I think there are two ways a team can approach this. One is they sit down, they crunch the numbers, and they try to do the math, right? You go at all these civilians. To what extent would they support the government? To what extent do they have means available to prevent themselves from doing anything that supported the government? Did they have agency in terms of the actions they were taking? Were they following orders? Were their lives threatened, etc. And you could just go through all of those scenarios one by one, which ethnic groups were they from? Was they involved in the political decision-making process, etc.? You could go through those criteria one by one and try to figure out some kind of sliding scale for all those factors. That's a bit of that sounds already, and OP is going to have a field day the moment they hear this proposal. That sounds like such a pain that's going to be contested, that's going to get delayed. Which is why I think the more modest proposal on government is just to carve out a class of exempt citizens so they're clearly innocent. So, for example, probably the people who were victims of a lot of these wrongdoings, probably the people who were explicitly shut out of political decision making, maybe, for example, the opposition that was suppressed in order to get away with these atrocities. So that's the sort of distinction she would make. It can either be done manually, so in that case, it's more accurate, but it's also pragmatically a bit of a difficult thing to do, or you can just carve out exemptions. Opposition team would question whichever aspect of that the Gov proposal is not strong in.
So given that we have now those definitions for these terms in the motion, I guess we can now go to the meat and potatoes of everything. So if you were in government, what do you think are the crucial arguments to run? Because it seems like, given that there is like a fun term here about being complicit and what it could mean, there's a lot of different things you can argue. So I want to ask what you think are essential that every debate must have, especially if you're a government team.
So I think like the logistics of rebuilding a country are going to change from room to room and from what teams are familiar with. But I think the core of it, there really is a principle that invasions suck. Why are innocent people who had nothing to do with these atrocities being punished and being forced to pay the cost of these invasions? Right. So I do think that this is a round where the principled argument is quite strong, especially because it's very easy to play up just how vulnerable these people are, how they had nothing to do with it, and they're still being treated equally as people who did something wrong. I do think another central argument, more on the pragmatic side, is the need to reconstruct the country in a way that prevents you from having to do this again, right? Because again, like invasions are incredibly messy, lots of people die. So at the point where you leave, one, you want to leave before something horrible happens, because they're being occupied by foreign power for an extended period of time. But two, when you leave, you want to make sure that things don't implode, right? And that is probably going to involve some kind of rebalancing, giving those who are out of power and were exploited in the past the ability to defend themselves, while not making it so excessive as to them becoming some kind of minority government that just like spokes on a wheel, turns on the people who were once oppressing them in the past. So that's the kind of balance that government is going to want to strike. So a principle about innocence and why you can never punish these civilians. Two, probably a pragmatic argument about the need to restructure the problems that existed in the form of government prior to the intervention.
So on the other hand, what are the essential arguments that you would expect most, if not all, debates to have on opposition bench?
I think Gov has their pet principle. OP also has their own pet principle, right? This is in many ways a bit of a hubristic attempt by countries that does not fully understand the intricacies of what it's dealing with, especially if it's like just whoever the UN called to task for this, that probably does not fully understand the nuances of who was involved, how were they involved, etc. And whether in actuality or even just in perception, this could be something that makes these divisions worse. Especially if you're giving privileged status to a group of people that's already quite hated in that country. You could arguably worsen a lot of ethnic tensions, and you could do it despite having the best intentions as a country that doesn't fully understand the local climate. So a hands-off, neutral, hold elections, let democracy see the side approach might not be perfect, but it's arguably the best thing that does not have a really bad outcome attached to it. I think the other side of the principle is like, what does it mean to be complicit? Like, at a certain point, if you argue that barring literally being imprisoned and having no control and not being born, generally speaking, insofar as you are still instrumental to the existence of that state, or even if you still voted against that state or you protested against that state, you still help them achieve their goals by being a productive citizen there, that's still something that maybe doesn't make you a bad person, but also means you have something to repay to the people who were wrong. Or even if you're part of that group but still assisted in the functioning of the state, that could also be an argument for everyone being complicit to some extent. The other thing I would do on OP, and this is just the fun part, like just drown it in pragmatics. Like, what does it mean to be innocent? Will people accept this? Will this take forever? Will this be contested to death? Will this government possibly be even worse than the one that preceded it? Especially if it's a form of minority rule. It's like paint the apocalypse. It's fun. And that's just drowns them in pragmatics.
So thank you so much for the analyses for all three motions. So I like how they can all be about the same thing, but they're fundamentally all different in terms of their focus. And I guess it's just that we got lucky that, well, not lucky, but it's just a coincidence really that there is a big major event that we're living through once again that applies to all these motions. So I guess to conclude though, Miggy, I wanted to ask a question that I'm sure a lot of debaters, especially the new ones, want to know about as well. So I'm not just going to ask you for advice for novice debaters. I kind of want to ask specifically, how do you deal with rounds and debates where you know nothing about? So perhaps it would help if you could give an anecdote or a situation you've been in where you absolutely knew nothing. And what mindset do you think debaters should have when they encounter things like NATO or the EU and they just don't know what to say?
Oh man. Oh man. That's always rough. I think the first thing is sometimes I guess it's like related to the advice I gave earlier. Like sometimes it's not only about matter, it's also still the normal rules of debate. So it's about proving incentives, it's about, first principles of how do states act and respond to incentives? Is it based on a balance of power? Is it based on wanting to be aligned politically all the time so that you can cooperate and engage in treaties? So a lot of it isn't based. I don't want to give the people the advice not to read, but a lot of it is also based on proving incentives. Like if you don't have an understanding of what the specifics in a motion are, like the specific countries, you probably do still have an understanding of how states in general act when faced in certain situations. If you don't have an understanding of that, you can definitely come up with what is a reasonable reaction to this in prep. I remember, I think it was my UADC Octos 2 years ago with Naj and Ina. We had, I think it was like Saudi Arabia, should they have closer ties with China and the US? I wasn't I wasn't as much of an Arab person back then. Naj hadn't read it, Ina hadn't read it. I'm like, oh no. And it was a set, and it was three emotions we didn't really know a lot about. And we ended up with the we vetoed the most unfamiliar motion. We put a 1 on the least unfamiliar motion, and we're stuck with Saudi Arabia, China, and the US. And I guess like it came back to like first principles talaga, right? Like what are your basic understandings of each of these countries? Like Saudi Arabia, even if you don't know how its economy works, it's a monarchy in a very relatively unstable region, and it probably has security threats it has to deal with. You know that China is another authoritarian country that is wanting to expand its influence outside its region. You know that the US, even if you don't know that the US has a close military relationship with Saudi Arabia, at the very least that it has some interest in the Middle East and some interest in courting Middle Eastern countries. And we didn't win that round. But slowly, based on just starting with what do we know about these countries, even if it's really limited, and carving out incentives from those premises, we were able to come up with at least a cohesive case, right? So I guess to sum this up, it's still debating, right? Your examples are not going to win or lose you on their own. But it's also the ability to logically prove them. And even if you don't have, like the specifics of the matter, you always have the ability to like prove things based on the limited stuff you do know. And sometimes that can be a benefit too, right? You don't bog down your entire case on the one piece of matter that you really want to come out in the round, but you're actually starting from first principles and premises and building it out as a case like you would in any other debate round. So my advice is just treat it like debate. My other advice is like don't be salty if you lose. It's the luck of the draw. It happens even to the best of us. So don't sweat it too much.
Yeah. So thank you so much for teaching us that even these serious topics, even if you lose, that's okay. And this is also something that we personally believe in. Like debate is all about like your own personal growth, being able to process what you know about learning. as much as you can, wherever you can. So we're very thankful to have had you in our podcast and as a motion contributor, because you actually did learn a lot from talking to you about these things. Especially, like, there are so many things that are happening around the world today, and it tends to be very overwhelming. Well, when you structure it in like debate world or a podcast world or in a post debate analysis, it helps us make sense of these things. So we really thank you again for agreeing to appear on our podcast and to be our motion contributor. And that's it for this episode. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you again, Miggy.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.